Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today to this OnGo Alliance webinar on neutral host solutions. We'll get started up here in just another minute or two, get everyone a chance to get logged in, and then we'll get started. Well, it looks like the number of attendees is climbing as people get logged in. So we'll get started then. Welcome to today's webinar. If you go to the next slide, our agenda for this is pretty straightforward. We'll give a quick introduction on the OnGo Alliance and introduce our panel, and then we'll get started with our question and answer and hopefully get a good conversation going. I see we're already getting some questions in the question tool here on the webinar. If you have questions, please put them there and we will get to them. And hopefully you get some good information out of this. Go to the next slide. I guess this is our nice welcome slide today. Welcome again coming to this call. If you go to the next slide, a brief introduction on the OnGo Alliance in this call. By joining this event, you agree to the terms of our privacy policy, which was in the event invitation. We are recording this event for use by the OnGo Alliance. And again, please use that question function as we go forward. And we'll get to those questions here in a moment. So if you don't want to be recorded or don't want to participate, feel free to log off, but thank you for joining us. Go to the next slide, please, Kevin. The OnGo Alliance, we're an industry organization devoted to supporting the deployment of LTE and 5G in the CBRS band. We are a member-driven organization, and we do lots of different activities. We have our certification program. We also are developing our specifications, things like coexistence manager and other things as well. And we also help market the technology and what's being developed by our members, both in terms of devices and services. And then we support the ecosystem by providing white papers and guidance on how to deploy OnGo networks and help get people in touch with the folks that are experts to help resolve any issues as they come up and help you find the service providers that can help you deploy these networks. That's the quick version of the OnGo Alliance, but moving on to the next slide, we'll actually dive into our actual topic today. We're looking specifically here at neutral host networks and getting a good discussion going on solutions for neutral host. And if we go to the next slide, this leads often to the first question of what is a neutral host network? And to do this at a really high level, the basic idea of a neutral host network is a single network provides coverage and services to subscribers to multiple public networks. So users from any of the major networks can use a neutral host network, and it can be done seamlessly, or it's a third party essentially that is providing coverage to multiple subscribers or multiple networks that are participating in the neutral host. That's the basic idea of a neutral host. It is a network that provides service to multiple carriers and operators in a seamless fashion. If we go to the next slide, there are a couple of different ways we can go about this. There's a bunch of different types. There's MORAN, there's MOCAN, there's a bunch of other solutions. And it really, the difference between them is all how much of the infrastructure of the network is shared by this neutral host, how much is shared and how much is allocated to the different operators. We're not going to go into the details of those. I'm going to say that MOCAN seems to be the version that seems to be the most successful in the marketplace, where it's the most interest right now. And it's the best solution for an OnGo or CBRS band deployment, it looks like. So that is a quick introduction into what neutral host is. We're going to move on immediately to our panel discussion. And if we go to the next slide, I think is where we have our participants in our panel. I'm going to introduce each of you, and after I introduce, please give a quick bio. Here, we'll just go in the order that are on the slide. First is Santosh Hosturg with Cisco. He is Director of Technology. And Santosh, could you tell us a little about yourself and your experience with Neutral Host and OnGo?
Hey, good morning. So I've been with Cisco for a little over 2 years, and I've been in the industry for the last 27 years, 16 years in the US, supporting AT&T, Verizon, and other customers, primarily focusing on the RAN, also end-to-end system architecture too. Thank you.
So thank you much. Next up is Rob Sorbonne with CTS, where he's the VP of Product Management and Marketing.
Hey, thanks a lot for the intro, Ed. Yeah, I've been with CTS and a predecessor company for about 3 years. I was really brought in to help the organization focus on launching a private cellular network as a service offering, and MoCA networks would certainly be part of that. I've got about 25 years in the industry in various kind of roles, from consulting to product management, primarily in the wireless space with both mobile operators, cable companies, and satellite companies as well. So.
Excellent, thank you. And then next up is Jonathan Pauly with Cal Poly, where he is an advisor and 5G program manager. Tell us a little about yourself, Mr. Pauly.
Hi, morning everyone, good afternoon. Jonathan Pauly. I am the program manager and technical lead for the new 5G Innovation Lab at Cal Poly, where we partner with AWS, T-Mobile, and Federated Wireless as our initial partners and founding members. And we collaborate with the students in innovating the adoption of 5G architectures to support the campus. It's a living lab around operations, connectivity services, R&D. We're one of the largest campuses in the country with varied terrain, hills, piers. We're involved in aviation and a multidisciplinary campus. So lots of opportunity to bring projects to students, as well as support the university and serve as a model for other campuses around the country.
Excellent, thank you much. Next up is Kyung Moon with Mobile Experts, where he's a principal analyst. Could you tell us a little about yourself, sir?
Great, thanks, Ed. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyung Moon. I am an industry analyst with Mobile Experts. We follow various segments of the mobile infrastructure segment. Some of the areas that I cover are in private wireless, in-building wireless space, and obviously Neutral Host Network is part of that scope. So I'm looking forward to having this lively discussion with fellow experts here.
Excellent, thank you. And last, certainly not least, Joel Lindholm with Infinigy, where he is CEO and co-founder. Could you tell us about yourself, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Ed, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. So Joel Lindholm, I've been around the CBRS Alliance pretty much since day one. Prior, I was with a company called Ruckus Networks, which we were founding members of the Alliance. The last 3 years I've spent at Meta, where we pioneered the innovation around this Neutral Host Network and how we're deploying it. So we had, there's a panel discussion at Mobile World Congress that you may see that has where we talked about kind of business case and what we're doing around that. And since have founded Infinigy, so that we can go and deliver this Neutral Host Networks to others in the industry. So happy to talk more in depth about that, and looking forward to the discussions. I also co-chair the business working group of the OnGo Alliance, so there's a little heritage amongst a bunch of the folks here on the panel, so good friends.
Excellent, thank you much, Joel. So to kick things off, I'll ask a couple of questions to get things going. And this is to you, Joel. First, what do you see are the key differences from the perspective of a venue owner, the like, between a neutral host and a private network? Where do you see the key differences?
Sure, it's a good topic. It's one that I think merits a lot of discussion from an industry perspective. You can see private networks, you can open any trade rag and see some commentary about a private network. And certainly CBRS as a band has been used largely for private network use cases, because it does give the flexibility to whoever's deploying that to own and operate and put whatever devices on that network. And that, I think, has been a huge enabler from an industry perspective. And it's changed the way people think about use of cellular. It's called the innovation band for a reason. And so that's been kind of historically the use cases. And there's a lot of ability to participate in that, whether you're a mobile operator, cable operator, an integrator, enterprise. There's a lot of, I think we're at the cusp of innovation around what can be done with a private network because of the flexibility that it offers to those enterprise customers. What we're here to talk about today, though, on a neutral host network, is largely a public-facing network. So very different. It's private devices on the private side, but it's public devices on the neutral host network. The whole concept is around that your AT&T, Verizon, or T-Mobile phones work when you walk into a property. But in order to make that work, you have to collaborate with the mobile operators. And so there's kind of a fundamental difference when you look at those two, because they're for two different purposes altogether. And we'll spend a lot of time today around the focus on just the neutral host aspect of that. And hopefully we'll surface some of the implications to it from an enterprise perspective, but also as folks that are in the neutral host business.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Well, next up, Kyung, can you give us a little insight into what you see, how the market for neutral host networks and indoor coverage, how you anticipate it evolving over the next couple of years?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I think Joe spoke really well, articulated very well about the need or the prospect for neutral host networks. The way we see it is, the CBRS spectrum, which is the basis for some of the neutral host networks that we're talking about here, that is something that operators have been deploying for their use, for their macro, and as well as some of the densification efforts. So that spectrum being utilized today, and as we think about the utilization of that particular spectrum and devices that will support it, obviously there's a usage in the private wireless applications for enterprise use, but at the same time, as Joe alluded to, there is a need for leveraging that network infrastructure for the public services. So, as we know, the carriers have a finite budget, capex budget to deploy across very broad nationwide networks, right? Both from macro and all the various places that they need to deploy. But in many cases, there are many what we call mid-size or underserved buildings out there or venues. So those places need to be addressed. So I think we believe, in our perspective, the CBRS spectrum or on-go certified devices, both from infrastructure and the handset and various other types of end-user devices, can be leveraged there. So today, that particular segment is a small percentage of the overall in-building wireless spend across the various architectural choices. But we feel that's going to be growing at over about 20% CAGR over the next 5 years. So we see a pretty bright future ahead. I think it will be driven by both need in the marketplace and the fact that we need to find a cost-effective solutions to address some of this smaller venue as compared to very large public venues that we are familiar with, like stadiums and airports.
Okay, let's see. We're actually already seeing a lot of questions here in the chat log here, so I'm going to start going to those here right away. Now, the first question I see here, and I think probably Jonathan, you might be able to address this from your perspective, but of course, everyone is willing to jump in, please do. But what sector do you see the most interest in for NHN solutions?
Off the top of my head, I mean, I'm coming from the higher education sector, so I'm biased to campuses, of course, because there's a dearth of demand in terms of the need for getting students connected beyond what we can deliver with Wi-Fi. Students consume 20 times more bandwidth than they did when they first set up these networks. And so rather than always hopping onto our Wi-Fi, we can connect the MNOs into our campus, which we've started to do in partnership with T-Mobile. We've set up a MOCN. We've brought in carrier grade service into these very dense concrete or e-glass buildings that use modern architecture. We're upping our game from the technical side in terms of, okay, how do we design RF to maximize the experience for students both inside the classroom and outside. One of our most important use cases is around safety. We have a rural campus, so we have engineering and space right next to cattle and chickens, all in the same space. And we have rolling hills that are very difficult for the carriers to get signal out, and students go hiking. There's been incidents that injuries, etc., and they can't get emergency services. So neutral host for us, from our perspective in higher ed, lets us deploy those emergency services to dark spots in campus very quickly and inexpensively relative to traditional DASs. And then, of course, with one MNO, if you're AT&T or another customer from another MNO, you can still get service on our network at Cal Poly. My background's actually in energy. I spent the first 15 years of my career in oil and gas with Chevron doing field compute, remote surveillance, and the like. And I see a huge opportunity within energy, industrial sectors, factory floors, agriculture, viticulture. And with the university, we get to go hands-on with a lot of different industries and bring in partners to kind of feel those pain points. And it's been amazing how many different representatives from industries have approached us to say, hey, we have these challenges, and can we use this living lab that we've created to prove out some of these private cellular concepts, CBRS, 5G architectures, neutral host just kind of being the latest capability we deployed back in May.
And I can jump in on that too. We're seeing really there's two buckets of users for the different technologies, right? And I think Joel talked pretty well initially about private wireless and the applications there, right? And that network is really, think of that as like inwardly focused for the enterprise itself versus the public network, which Joel also mentioned. And the key thing is we're going to talk a lot today about the neutral host network, and that's sharing this network across multiple public carriers. But you can run this network and share it between multiple public carriers as well as the enterprise side, right? The private. So you can run this and share all that infrastructure, which provides some very strong economic benefits for the enterprise. But in terms of neutral host customers, the use cases that we're seeing or the verticals that we're seeing are really anyone that has a significant amount of kind of either tenant traffic or guest kind of foot traffic, right? So it would be things like Jonathan mentioned, universities, it would be office buildings, it would be, conventions, anything with kind of large public venues. We see a huge opportunity in healthcare where there's actually a pretty strong opportunity for kind of the private network side as well. And it's really the interesting piece about the platform and the technology that we're going to talk about is, this brings a tool to the building owner or operator or tenant to get them that indoor coverage at a price point that really wasn't there before. These DAS networks, which have been out there, to a large extent have been funded by the carriers, and that's been kind of falling off over the last few years as they've diverted more funding out to the densification of the macro network, which has kind of pushed the in-building coverage problem back to the building owner or the occupant. And at the same time, as Jonathan mentioned, a lot of these environmental friendly, energy efficient construction methods have actually made the buildings, a lot more energy efficient, but they've also made them a bit into Faraday cages where it's tougher to get the macro network signal into the buildings. And so it's become incumbent upon the enterprises to kind of solve that problem themselves. And the DAS infrastructure or the kind of historic legacy DAS architectures haven't really scaled down to where it was cost effective for enterprises, less than maybe 250,000 square feet to kind of get an in-building solution. They had the demand is there, and the need is there. The challenge was really just how to kind of balance the cost with getting that coverage solution. And we've had different tools out there, for some time to address some of these smaller buildings and getting that coverage inside, things like repeaters, but they weren't necessarily super elegant solutions. They didn't interact with the macro network very well. The carriers don't really like them because they cause a little bit of havoc there. But for kind of the middle prize, this is really ultimately going to be a pretty good solution for the middle prize, where they can, get a cost-effective solution for getting that in-building coverage for them in those areas with a lot of foot traffic.
Yeah, kind of,
Go ahead.
Yeah, just going to comment. From an analyst perspective, we typically look at, across the different vertical sectors, kind of categorize under what we call private spaces, smaller private spaces. You don't really need, multiple multi-operator type of systems. So that you can get by with some of those venues, but there are many places, even mid-size or even smaller spaces, that are what we call public, meaning that you have a lot of different constituents, whether tenants or even Jonathan mentioned in campuses, you have kids or students and faculty members and staff coming in with the various operator plans, bring your own device kind of plan. So you need to address multi-operator requirements. So in that regard, you do need this neutral host network, because as enterprises deploy network infrastructure, obviously from whoever is putting that infrastructure, you want to get the most out of that investment. So you want to address your private need, your private wireless application needs, as well as neutral host network needs as well.
Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone said there. I think the verticals that need a neutral host the landscape of in-building coverage or neutral host coverage is going to be viewed very differently than it has historically. Right? Historically, Rob had mentioned, right, the carriers would fund the DAS. That kind of pigeonholed the people that could get it as to what made good business sense from a carrier perspective and from the technology that was used to go deploy those networks. So there's a lens that people have historically looked at using the carrier spectrum and all the business elements that are associated with that. Now that we have a tool that we can use, it is another tool in the toolbox. There may still be DAS in many venues. There may be this neutral host network in many venues, but it opens up that lens to who could possibly use it. Before, it would have only been bigger buildings with a lot of people in it. Now it could be a smaller building that has a safety need because of 911 purposes and not a lot of people to it. So the verticals of being office spaces or K through 12 or higher ed, hospitals, hotel, like it opens a different set of opportunities for property owners to put in building coverage in that are not burdened by the same legacy kind of mindsets. It's another tool, but it's a tool that, if used properly, can really open up and solve problems for a lot of different verticals. But it will be a very different lens. Some, as folks talked about, might look through a lens of, I need the combination of private networks and neutral host. Some may say, I just want neutral host. Some may say, hey, I just want private networks. And so with the emergence of this as being an opportunity, changes that landscape dramatically. And it'll evolve over time. Like,
yeah, I mean, just to conclude here, I mean, Jonathan mentioned about the coverage in the university and campus. We have analyzed like thousands of samples from OpenSignal, which, I mean, Tutela particularly. There's a lot of coverage hole in campuses and also in medical centers where carrier coverage is not sufficient enough. DAS may be a solution for carrier, but neutral host model can change it. We can bring the coverage to places today are not being served for all operators. So clearly there's a play if you want to provide coverage, and the ARPU and business rationale will change this.
I was going to put one twist on this at the end. So we talked a lot about the carriers and kind of dense population centers. There's the other end of the spectrum, and that's ultra rural, where the carriers don't provide coverage. And I'm really interested in this opportunity for neutral hosts to serve the creation of alliances. I'm thinking about neighboring operators in oil and gas, agriculture, viticulture, where they can pool capital and deploy networks with or without the MNOs, and share that that cost and enable connectivity and digital transformation at the far-flung edge in these ultra-rural use cases for industry. That I get excited about. It's maybe a little bit further out there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and Jonathan, utilities there as well, I think, could be a valuable part of that equation.
Well, we're getting a lot of questions related to the carriers. So I'm gonna at least start off with you, Joel, because I know you've done this. What does it take to get the carriers involved in deploying or supporting one of these networks? What are the considerations there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic for sure. As we emerged the model, it was just starting with a clean sheet of paper. Like, what are priorities, right? The user, right, couldn't make any changes to the cell phone, but it's a large issue why Wi-Fi calling is not used a lot. For us, it had to be a benefit for how to deploy and operate a network and give us our flexibility of building sizes. To the carriers, right, they have responsibilities, right? They have 911, all the regulatory related pieces. It's their brand showing up on the phone, so they've got legitimate concerns to say that this network is gonna carry the criteria that they have for their network. So you have regulatory requirements, you've got use requirements and performance attributes. So having to go through all of those details, it kind of emerged as needing this neutral host operations entity that would do that. So it would look on behalf of the carriers for the service that's being provided and all that criteria that I kind of spoke about here. So from a first step, it was, okay, the carriers needed to feel comfortable and the networks needed to be viable. There's a business case element to it. Legacy models versus, I think Rob had said, it's largely coming venue funded today. So those things needed to be considered or need to be considered when you approach the carriers. And likewise, they don't want to have thousands of enterprises coming to them and saying, hey, I want to go throw my network on here, because there's highly unlikely thousands of enterprises are going to be able to deliver those to those criteria. And so you need to work with an entity that has that capability and has those relationships with the carriers to fulfill those obligations. And so I think each carrier kind of has their own dynamic to them, which is always interesting to see. But at the end of the day, they care about subscribers that are in your properties and venues properties. And so there's a bit of a dynamic, I'd say, of the neutral host operations side and the coverage that is effectively there for the mobile operators. So a number of different dynamics to look through when you go through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing today, and I think Joel would echo the same thing, are really about, from the carrier side, it's less about does the technology work? I think it's a lot more how to scale it for them to adopt it, right? And some of the stuff has nothing to do with MOCN. It's like tools that they've developed to provision cell sites and roaming cell site lists, right? And they're limited because they're used to a macro network, which can only physically have so many sites, right, in a geographic area. It's like, how do they actually activate and provision, VPNs into each one of these enterprise that have one of these networks, right? They're not set up to provision thousands of VPNs, like on a weekly basis. So I do agree. I think that what Joel is saying is that on the, the aggregation, I think the carriers are largely looking for, some subset of group of integrators, operators, neutral host providers to sit in between, right? To kind of aggregate those footprints and aggregate that traffic into them, both to ease the operational requirements on them, as well as, I mean, there is a fair amount to be had to understand how to work with the carriers, to understand, what their design criteria are for these networks, to make sure that the networks are maintained and operating over time, and that they're able to get reporting back for, key performance indicators to make sure that the network is operating consistently with the way that they would want to see it. I mean, we're seeing that the design criteria is a little bit more stringent than we would typically do for just a private wireless network where it doesn't have the public carrier on it as well. And then, I mean, I think we're also seeing varying degrees of, kind of buying into this. I mean, we've got one carrier that Jonathan's already mentioned that, they're pretty much all in and they're out there ready to go. I mean, I think the other two carriers are in varying stages. I think you'll see one of them kind of jumping in a little bit deeper into the water, literally in real time. The third one's probably going to take a little bit longer, but I do think that we have to be careful, and enterprises need to be careful too, and understand what's the problem that they're trying to solve, right? I mean, I think they need to work with people that can help them solve their problem, which ultimately is really getting, that in-building coverage for voice and or data services. If you get kind of too stuck into a particular technology, that may not work well. I know we're talking a lot about CBRS neutral host networks here, but I mean, I think in the near term, you're going to have a lot of hybrid networks where, you may have, one or two carriers on a CBRS neutral host network and a third carrier still using licensed spectrum. And I think that's going to vary by the carriers. I think it's going to vary by where the actual enterprise is located. If it's in a rural area, some folks are favoring, one implementation over another. And the good thing is that on the radio infrastructure side, there's a lot of the newer radio vendors, we can support multiple bands of spectrum, so we can do carrier licensed spectrum in connection with, CBRS band on the same set of radio infrastructure, so that you're not deploying multiple costly networks on top of each other and having to maintain those. So.
If I can add on one thing, a couple things I forgot to say, in terms of the carriers and that engagement with the carriers, and it has to dovetail with what I was talking about earlier about the kind of legacy models versus, I'll say, a newer model here. From a venue owner perspective, when we built it at Meta, was I needed coverage for all three carriers. Like it didn't do any good to have one, because you've got either visitors or employees that have all three. And so that was the problem statement, a big part of the problem statement. The legacy models from a DAS perspective, when it's using their licensed bands, you had to go lobby with each of the carriers to come on board, and that justified all these business cases that came along. So by and large, you could get many properties with just one carrier on it, and they're not likely going to go freely bring on their other carrier brethren if it was done by one of the carriers themselves. And so it's a very different lens when you go to engage with a carrier to say, look, right, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, times three carriers, my private network needs and whatnot, and look through that lens. That's a really big, important piece, rather than falling back to kind of legacy viewpoints.
Yeah, from our view is that, Rob talked about one particular carrier is kind of all in on this, and the other one is kind of on the, I would say, not all in, but favorable to this ideas. But I think, the competition, in our view, is going to drive to address, again, it's by particular venue by venue and types of applications, but I think that will drive the ecosystem to scale. I mean, obviously, we're talking about very large operators, so they're all S-scale operators, so they're not going to deal with, tens of thousands of enterprise or particular venue coming to them to connect their core networks to, so that you could provide the neutral host or public services over a neutral host network. So it's going to be, will require a handful or possibly more than that initially to get the carriers on board, because I think Rob mentioned this, right? It's not just the technology, but also the whole process and KPI, key performance indicator metrics that needs to be met, because carriers going to be very careful about what they connect, because Joe mentioned this, right? Is the carrier brand on the phone? If if the neutral host network doesn't meet the particular KPI requirements and falls below their requirement, that's going to be on them, on the operators. So they're going to be very careful. But once this, I would call it the floodgate of KPI, the process as well, process of working with a particular operator gets resolved, I think the rate of adoption will increase over time. So that's kind of our view. Is it's gonna take time, but it's gonna be where the market, market forces, as well as the fact that we have limited capex to address all the different needs. Right, carrier is going to be talking about they're deploying on C-band, but there's going to be new bands coming on, and densification efforts going to require additional investments. So they're going to be careful about where they spend their capital dollars.
Yeah, you're spot on, Kyung, and that's what we observed. Was we're kind of early in this transition, and we're cutting our teeth, and we're working with our partners to figure out how do you scale this approach. From my perspective, though, like this is a physics problem. There's a forcing function here in terms of you only have so much physical space, and radio densification is only getting greater. We have to deal with aesthetics committees. We have to deal with the Coastal Commission. Like you can't just slam everybody's radio as these networks get, denser and denser onto these street poles in beautiful San Luis Obispo or on your buildings in your campus. Like it's not possible. So physics is going to prevent us from just throwing more and more radios out there. So network sharing, neutral host technology, whatever we do, it has to start happening. And so we're just moving early. And yeah, there's a lot of learnings to have around, how do you scale and operationalize and automate and apply more software development practices, I'd say, to the deployment of these networks. And there's a lot of work to be done. And that's it's really been exciting to work with these partners as we kind of learn along the way with the carriers, with the integrators, with the cloud vendors. But yeah, seems inevitable. There's still a lot of work to be done, but Kyung's spot on, I think, in terms of the hard work that needs to happen still to make this scale.
All right, well, thank you much. Let's see, some of the other questions. We're seeing a couple of questions about emergency services and what's involved in that. You've already touched a little bit on it, Jonathan, but Santosh, could you talk a little bit about what's involved in doing emergency services and what can be provided over a neutral host?
Yeah, definitely. So we are primarily looking here for CBRS-based neutral host deployment, but like the needs of tenants and also the neutral host operator emerges, we are going to install and support licensed carrier bands too, because most of the emergency call and voice calls today are on low band coverage. So essentially we will have a low band, let's say, frequency assigned with the carrier for enabling emergency support, and positioning is an important thing. So we need to have the neutral host also support indoor positioning as well. That means the deployment will now look at LMF and other entities as well, a full-fledged core network. So the flavor of neutral host deployment, of course, will be based on business model and the overall revenue sharing and business agreement. But for the neutral host, you can enable a full-fledged network having IMS, LMF, and all the core components for providing location, or you can just use the user equipment to have an algorithm to choose a carrier band and get all the emergency services. Like Jonathan mentioned, you are looking at some of that kind of operations, right?
Maybe I can add on to that a little bit. There's the people with the regulatory responsibility for fulfilling 911, emergency services, other regulatory things, preemption, if there's some event that happens, the people with that obligation are the carriers. They're the ones that issue the phone, and that's the one the FCC looks forward to. So we need to make sure that the network fulfills those obligations. And by and large, if you step back and look at it, LTE is LTE. 5G is obviously still emerging, but LTE it's a cellular network. So having those services come through that network needed to be done before it could become a viable service for somebody to go use. And so in our case, we use just CBRS because the network, it does, there's some nuances to test through, but at the end of the day, passing through 911 calls, is not a big deal because it's just an LTE network, small cells and gateways and whatnot. But on the back end servers, I think Rob might have alluded to it as well, that the back end services that need to be provisioned by the carriers need to be in place. And so as you step forward, when you move from a data only private network into something that is carrying voice and is carrying 911 traffic, then you need to be able to go and ensure that carriers need to ensure that they have their obligations done. And in that way, it starts to become looking more like some more of the legacy models, that they need to verify that that 911 call comes from the proper location and goes to the proper PSAP so that they can go and some emergency responder can go fulfill it. And so the network absolutely has the capabilities to do it. It has to be done in a very tight control. And I think that's one of that's the key mechanism. Like, performance is great and they don't want poor performance from to their subscribers. At the end of the day, they have to make sure life or death regulatory services are delivered through this network. And so, but it's LTE, right? It's more of that operational stuff that Rob had talked about.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the folks, are getting to the point where, that's a big part of the commissioning process, right? And working with the carriers and making sure that kind of the PSAP gets provisioned correctly, testing those connections, testing kind of the wireless priority service. And I think a couple of years ago, especially related to CBRS, a lot of the early folks that stepped into that business were really focused on kind of the data only aspects, because it was more around the private wireless piece, right? So you didn't have a lot of those regulatory requirements on the private network. So the radios by the OEMs that were really coming out of the cellular infrastructure for the carriers were the ones that had more of that functionality. But I think at this point, most of the radios that are out there in the CBRS band, either have those capabilities or, are going to have them very shortly. And like I said, it really just becomes part of that commissioning process and then kind of testing to get the sign off by the carrier that, hey, yeah, we're now kind of approved to make sure that this thing is working. And that involves, whoever's installing the network, testing it, but also the carrier, in a lot of cases is going to have folks coming out and doing some testing, on their end as well for each carrier. And there was some things that did have to be resolved to be able to get the, multiple carriers working on the same set of infrastructure and things routing back to the PSAP correctly for each carrier. But I think that's largely, those pieces have largely been resolved at this point. So.
Maybe I could add a little context there. We whiteboarded kind of where we wanted to go next, which initiative we wanted to take on, and it was 911 services and neutral hosts. We only came to that decision in January. February, we started to sketch it out. We went from concept to a deployed 911 service in about 3 to 4 months, and deployed new infrastructure, the neutral host, integrated with the carrier, 911 services, and had all of that online in a matter of a few months. So just to kind of give it a sense of scale. Now, we haven't provided campus-wide coverage, but we wanted to demonstrate this can be done, do the work behind the scenes, understand it, and share these learnings like I am right now, and then continue to improve and scale.
Interesting. Let's see some of the other questions here, unless folks, anyone here on our panel would like to add something else on this. Okay, did get a question. Somebody was asking, just getting a little more technical, I guess, on CBRS. There were some concerns raised about band availability and like the heartbeat mechanism, and they were wondering how that's going to be evolving and how if anyone wants to speak to the use of the on-go band, particularly in light of heartbeat and C-band options as well.
Yeah, so maybe I can take this. So we have been very closely working with Federated Wireless. They have a great SaaS system, and they have a huge lot of APIs that support complete visibility of channels and bands. So it's very easy to actually allocate the bands and then look at what interference levels you are getting from neighboring vicinity, and then manage your interference according to the stats available for you. So it's not a big deal in terms of implementing this, provided SaaS is coordinated. And the SaaS also gives information from peer SaaS, like Google SaaS, for instance. So there is enough data and performance metrics that we can use to actually operate in an interference-prone environment with the right channels.
And I also believe too, I think that there has been a decision at the WIN forum, I believe, they actually changing some of the technical details, like the heartbeat mechanism is being modified actually to extend the time period on that as well. I know that's in discussion. I believe a decision was made, I think just a couple of days ago, about extending that.
There's a couple of things maybe add on that. From availability of spectrum perspective, yeah, I think that's, you know, Federated, Google, right? They've got mechanisms to be able to go and help somebody understand the availability of spectrum in your particular area. It's a different lens if you're in a building or if you're outside, and just the observations of what's there, right? So that's something, and there's planning tools that are available. I think people in the CBRS space can help kind of go through that part of it. When it comes to heartbeat, you know, obviously it's a critical element because, you know, we need to let the Navy know if the radars and whatnot, like, so it's got to be there for DoD purposes. But from a practical purposes of implementation, we're talking about either a network for private networks, which have some high-end use cases. We've got, in this case, a mobile public network that has 911 criteria. The network design itself, you know, the internet or connection in our case, the LAN infrastructure, the radios, right? That has to be there, and it has to be designed to the right quality level. If you're in a higher end, yeah, a hospital, you might have dual links that come into it for high availability purposes. So if you design that network properly, you shouldn't have an issue with the heartbeat getting through to let the SaaS know that you're using. And I do believe, as Ed said, there's resiliency opportunities for the SaaSes and the heartbeat, and whether timing and whatnot. So there's a number of things that'll evolve this over time, but I don't think that's an issue. It's something that people definitely need to understand, the implications in their deployment.
Okay, let's see. I've also gotten a couple of questions here talking about the architecture of your deployment in terms of are cloud-based solutions the way to go, or a local core network? Jonathan, since you've recently deployed and you touched on this briefly, how did that decision go down? How did you make that assessment, and was it a significant concern to you?
So our core is running on campus. Our network, I would say, is evolving. We're moving fast and iterating. We started with our network only a year ago with our first survey, and we started with a 5G standalone core running on a snow cone in our tech park next to the digital transformation hub. And we learned from that. We put a couple radios out in the middle of campus on Radio Hill, and another one indoor just to learn. And then we realized, well, hey, there's not a lot of 5G SA network devices. So we went with hybrid, and so we scaled up our core. We moved to a Snowball Edge that's running our core. We're running both 4G and LTE as well as 5G standalone. That core went into our new Frost Research and Innovation building at the core of campus, brand new, I think $600 million building, beautiful. And that kind of became our new launch pad for where we wanted to centralize our core network services, but then also we really have an eye towards scaling that up to the likes of Outpost and other, you know, mixed use edge hardware platforms, so that we can demonstrate, you know, R&D and augmented reality in these higher end use cases running next to our core. So the idea of getting students to build X apps and R apps and these new kind of deep network capabilities, we want to bring that on campus with an eye towards still using the SaaS in the cloud, of course, but failover into the cloud, et cetera, showing that yeah, that edge, sorry, the cloud to the edge to the rugged edge pattern. But yeah, we're still evolving and iterating right now. It's a Snowball Edge, And I have an eye towards getting that replatformed by the end of the year to an outpost.
Yeah, so in my opinion, it comes down to scaling, right? You want how many RRC connected users, like 16, 32, 64, or the likes of a carrier gate RRC connected users, 1028. So it comes down to scaling and neutral host business model. So if you're looking at virtual RAN now can offer possibility to assign the resources, scheduling resources accordingly for the neutral host tenants. So the business outcome has to be very well chosen. The radios to be selected have the right IBW and OBW in terms of supported bandwidth and instantaneous bandwidth, and also the agility in terms of selecting the frequency. So there's no one size fits all solution. So it's custom and specific approach. So you can choose small cell deployment. You can also go for DAS. Digital DAS is the best one to reduce the power consumption. But then again, you need to address this based on what's the right architecture. Like you showed in the beginning, right? The roaming model, MORAN model, and MOCN. MOCN is generally preferred. And if you have the right scheduling mechanism supported by the RAN, then there's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, I think Jonathan kind of provided a kind of a good example of the evolution, right? As and Santosh mentioned about depending on what specific requirements there are that your operators could or the enterprise can set, okay, what are my requirements? What are the applications I want to enable? So you may want to start with something simplified, perhaps even doing it at a cloud-based. But as you evolve and add more use cases, and those use cases become a little more depending on having the control on site, on premise, for both latency sensitive perspective as well as some control perspective and data sovereignty to make sure the data resides on premise, then you could evolve the architecture, right? So I think it depends on your level of comfort, and perhaps you start with cloud and you evolve into kind of hybrid model, and maybe even getting into putting up bigger platforms like Outpost to handle not just the core, but perhaps over time get into kind of virtualized RAN deployment models as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to add it, I mean, we want to keep it simple, no rewiring, right? All the Ethernet cables, but software you can play with. You can change, you can do all the changes with software.
Yeah, there's this observation I've had. I came more from an IT architecture background, and I picked up a nasty habit of RF along my way in the field. But it's interesting to see, like, RF kind of thinks in this fixed physical world, and it's starting to bleed into, now it's more software defined. The MOCN is a software component. It's not a physical component. You're starting to see this flexibility blend into the RF space to where you can apply like continuous integration, continuous deployment principles from software to your networks now. So when I say we started small with a snow cone and we're iterating, it's possible to do that now. These aren't in concrete like we used to think of RF deployments. They're flexible, they're adaptable. You have to have an eye towards enabling that in your architecture, and that's what we're working very closely with our partners on to make sure that what we're doing doesn't lock us into any kind of fixed physical platform, that we have the ability to flex and move and adapt and change rapidly with our network. And we've been doing a lot of that the last year, and we'll keep doing that. But I think we still have a lot to learn in that space. The other thing I was going to mention was at a university, we have very bursty workloads. Graduation, you spike, and you have like 50,000 people flood into your small little town, and they bring down the carrier networks. So having a hardware platform that we can scale up, scale down, even if it's in the campus or bursting into the cloud, these are all concepts we want to be able to apply to address that variable demand from a very heterogeneous set of customers.
I think a lot of it's funny, the lens, right? Jonathan talks from an enterprise lens, right? There's a lot of those implications are the very different snow cones for probably a lot of the IT-based applications and devices, and obviously wanting to do the public facing too. Like it'll be interesting to see how the architectures evolve over time based on serving both of those needs. And so I don't know if there's a preconceived notion as to what it is today. I mean, today's some building blocks, right? What it's going to look like in the future as it services both of those kind of needs, right?
It's been my observation, like the telco world has a very nice clean blueprint from the hyperscalers in terms of how do you deploy cell networks on the cloud. our opportunity that I've observed is taking some of this thinking and working with the hyperscalers to see how do you scale that down for the enterprise. A lot of the components are the same, a lot of the thinking's the same. It's just tailoring it to a different audience, different verticals. And that's kind of where I see us right now, is we're kind of taking this big, massive thinking that's been put out there for the telcos and seeing how can we apply it, scale it down, publish blueprints for other universities and enterprises to adopt. We see ourselves creating a repeatable platform that could be wrapped up, packaged up, and used at any higher ed education institution and rapidly deployed. That's one of the things we're working towards.
Okay, well, next up, we're getting a couple of questions, actually many questions regarding what kind of business models do we see this coming in? And Joel, you touched on it, talking about the legacy business models. What business models do you see being deployed here? What kind of business forms are you seeing? How is it evolving over the legacy setups?
Yeah, that's going to be an evolutionary topic, I should say. Because it started with the carriers funding DASs because they needed that connectivity. That pendulum has swung based on their rightfully so, their need of prioritizing investments in the macro networks, and so that's shifted to the enterprise from a funding perspective. I was talking at a different panel a few months ago at an event, and the carriers make it really clear they don't have budget to go. I mean, they have budget, but limited budget to go put into the in-building side. And so, yeah, I do believe on the business side, the bulk of it will come from an investment. And if we're targeting this as a space that's unserved today, right? The carriers have already made the decision saying, I'm not going to go invest in that space, otherwise they'd have a DAS in the first place. And so I think the industry is going to have to follow along with that kind of a mindset. And so they're probably going to pay somebody to come and deploy a public network. I think likely it'll start on the backs of what the enterprise is willing to pay for the coverage they need, and they'll have to balance that over other priorities that they have within their budgets. But it has to be easy in order for, I think, the enterprise to consume it. So somebody shows up, does a network for them, they pay those entities, and then the money flows however it flows on the back end. But the business models will have to, I think, lend in that kind of direction in order for adoption to happen. Now, I'm sure you have a large venue, you've got thousands of subscribers in those venues. I'm sure the carriers still have an interest in playing in such venues, right? So some of those things, I think, will be inherited from legacy models. In the unserved space, they've already made a business decision, so it'll probably evolve slightly differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the legacy types of venues, you're still going to see the carrier funding, right? I mean, anything that's going to impact their root metrics scores, they're still going to want to pay for because they're not going to want to have poor scores that are going to make them look bad, right? The challenge is how do they fund these networks when they have the demand for these smaller types of venues? And like Joel said, I think that's an evolving model, and we're certainly prepared to support lots of different mechanisms there, and I suspect it's going to vary in some ways by industry as well, and kind of the way that they deploy dollars. If you look at like commercial real estate, a lot of those property owners tend to be REITs, and they want to put capital out there, right? So they're a little less inclined to go with kind of a like an as a service type model. There's definitely going to be a service component associated with this networks because you've got to maintain that connectivity into the carriers. We've got to provide kind of ongoing reporting and optimization. So I mean, there is going to be some sort of an ongoing piece, but it's possible that the entire thing is as a service and there's no upfront capital. It's possible that people are going to want to pay upfront for the infrastructure and then just pay the services like a maintenance fee. I think there's going to be everything, between those two pieces, right? And then the other thing, I think that to me is a little bit of a challenge is I think there's still some enterprises out there that think that somehow that this type of a network is going to be a revenue generator for them. And there's certainly going to be some instances where that's going to happen, but I think it's going to be the exception more than the norm. The carriers, I mean, part of what they're giving up in kind of buying into this network is they're kind of giving up control, right? It's like Joel said, I mean, their name is on the phone, right? And now they're kind of running a service over shared spectrum that they don't have complete control over, right? Somebody else is running that network for them. And if that's the case, they're willing to kind of tolerate getting the coverage, because even though I think most of the carriers at this point would say, hey, look, you enterprise guy, you built this building that's ultra energy efficient, and you're basically blocking the signals in, so it's your opportunity to go solve that problem, right? You pay for water, you pay for electricity, you got to pay for coverage. At the end of the day, they still want that problem solved, right? Because it makes their phone look bad, and if somebody else has that problem solved and they don't, it's not necessarily kind of the, it's not going to be the best play for them. The challenge is that if the enterprise is expecting that somehow they're going to get paid for that, or it's going to offset the cost of the network, that creates just a whole bunch of different people that have to get involved from the carrier perspective to be able to deliver this network. If it's just, hey, we're going to provide this network, the enterprise is going to pay for it, we just have to validate that it's going to work with our network and that we've got the visibility that we need, and we're going to get kind of the performance that we expect. That's one group of people. If you're now saying, hey, I want to get paid for it, there's a whole other group of people that's out there paying for networks today. And each carrier has a plan of record for properties that they're going after where they're going to pay for performance, right? The easy ones to look at are like, Super Bowl venues. I mean, there's a lot of planning going on right now for the World Cup in a few years. And they've got those lists of where they need to go and kind of build out that in-building coverage. If you're now saying, hey, I'm going to put this network in and I've got an 8-story office building, but I'm only going to do it if the carrier is going to pay for it, and now you're asking the carrier to actually come and look at your building and to make a judgment call as to whether your building is worthy or not, that's not a process that they're really kind of jumping into right now. They're kind of like, hey, look, if you guys want to pay for this, we're cool if you're going to pay for it, and we'll make sure it's going to meet our standards. But if you want us to pay for it now, I don't have a line for that yet. So I think that's one thing that gives me a little bit of pause today, is I still talk to, and it's not everybody, but you'll still talk to enterprises where they're like, well, why would I put this up otherwise, if I wasn't going to get paid for it? So it's just something for people to think about.
I mean, if I may add, if you look at non-terrestrial network, we are looking to fill coverage holes in existing terrestrial network and provide that service. If NTN is there to provide services for coverage areas that are not really covered at all, we need neutral host type of model indoors to coverage those areas. Predominantly we have seen staff and employees of an organization or hospitals use one particular network, which is the strongest presence in that. We want to break that. We want every operator to enable their network inside campuses and medical facilities. So clearly there's a business model if people are trying to willing to work together.
Yeah, we look at the market. When you look at, for example, we haven't talked about Wi-Fi, but when you look at the context of including both Wi-Fi, the cellular systems, whether it's talking DAS or small cells and everything combined, the cellular connectivity, in our view, is about 20% or less than 20% of the spend. So there is a lot of money being spent both by the enterprises as well as the carriers. But as we talked about, carrier has a limited capital dollars to focus on some of the in-building spaces outside of those high value venues like Super Bowl stadiums or World Cup stadiums. Those are just high profile, so there's going to be a spend going into those. But there are a lot of underserved or sometimes unserved types of venues that needs to be spent. So As we talked about earlier, there needs to be a kind of a scale player or someone kind of a managed service providers or neutral host providers come in, because you have to talk the telecom talk, knowing how the operators work, what the KPIs you need to meet. These are complex issues that it's not like putting up a Wi-Fi access points. And, people have built up that knowledge over decades, knowing how to put up campus networks and such. But, you have to now talk the lingo of telecom lingo and wireless talks, and that requires us some skill sets. So I think this is where an intermediary like a neutral host providers or managed service providers can provide that value add and also bring scale, so that this more sizable managed service provider can address a lot of these underserved, tens of thousands of underserved venues, where you can bring the scale and bring the knowledge to meet the need there. So to Rob's point, you can be a small enterprise and coming to the operator and say, okay, I'm going to put up a network and I'm going to have double-sided revenue generating type of a business model. That probably is not going to fly with operators, but there is an opportunity for intermediary to come in and provide that value, and not just for the enterprises, providing, serving the private wireless needs as well as the public service needs, but also providing a value to operators, saying, hey, I'll take care of these, but you have to kind of work with them to be able to connect to the core network and work out the back office processes. So I think there could be a win-win situation here, but again, it's going to be an evolving model over time.
Yeah, the business model side of things, like Joel said, is evolving. It's one of the things I'm actually as excited about the business model opportunities as I am about the technology. We work with all the colleges on the campus. I've been working with construction management, agriculture, computer science, but actually the College of Business is one of the biggest advocates for what we're doing. And I'm really looking forward to kind of working with those students on projects and our lab to understand what innovative business models are out there. And I think we have to get creative in the same way the business models around the cloud were so transformative and creative and innovative. I think there's a similar opportunity in this space with connectivity, more than just, roaming charges, this and that. Like, what can you do to share spectrum or create, MVNO type of agreements or marketing agreements? I mean, there's a whole host of approaches in terms of how you could partner and bring value to the carriers. I guess we are one of those larger customers in a way, because it's not just Cal Poly, we're one of 23 California state universities. So then what does it look like if you can actually align on a pattern and an architecture and make that repeatable, like we were talking about earlier, and then approach a carrier, and then you have a little bit more of a leg to stand on in these conversations, showing the carriers that you know what you're doing, that you have a repeatable pattern. But yeah, the novel and innovative, business models that haven't yet been defined, I think is going to be really exciting over the next coming years.
There's almost like three, listening to the conversation here, there's three different entities. There's the building venue owner entity. They've got to make their business decisions, whether it be serving a number of different entities, or can they bill their tenants if you're in the commercial real estate, or are they just serving their employees? Like, they've got is it a value to the building, right? They've got their lens to look at. From a neutral host operator perspective, there's cost involved, it's carrying the networks, there's infrastructure and basebands. It's a little different collective lens than what was a legacy model, but there's traffic and all that stuff. That's got to be in that neutral host operator kind of lens. The carriers have a fairly binary. Do I contribute or do I not? And we had taken the approach early on that in order for this to scale to the billions of square feet that are out there, you can't depend on the carrier saying, I'm going to go fund it. The trend is they're not going to do that. So if the model proceeds based on funding from them, you've got a limited supply chain of dollars associated with that. And so each of those have, I'd say, a little different lens, and those each will evolve over time. And if done right, I think it can become very pervasive, but it's got to be done right and in a conservative way. We've been big proponents of a very methodical rollout, right? Because the worst thing that'll happen is if the carriers some neutral network comes up and then the thing doesn't work well, right? And then it has a bad taste on it. Don't want that. So it has to very methodically be done, so the business models arrive, the technology models arise, the operational, like all that stuff has to come up. And I think a lot of that's pretty well understood as the first step, but it'll evolve certainly over in orders of magnitude of years, not like in months.
Okay. Getting some other related, getting a little more technical questions. Do we see that the carriers are going to have different requirements for a CBRS or NHN in terms of their KPIs and their metrics versus their own macro networks or versus DAS? Are they going to be the same, or is there going to be differences there?
So in terms of KPIs and network visibility, I mean, the carriers often strive to have the same KPI numbers because you can't have X outside and Y inside. So the KPI, I mean, there's no compromises on KPI level because carrier associate the performance to their network, right? So essentially both indoor and outdoors, they will see a consistent quality and KPI, but throughput, of course, will be dependent on the sharing models we have with neutral host model. So efficient sharing of neutral host, maybe they can include their path spectrum along with GAA, for instance. And then at the vRAN level, we can have the right resources engaged to provide the basic requirements. So you have to scale it according to what is the expectation in terms of radio throughput for the footprint.
I'll jump on, I guess. The KPIs, like Santosh said, was it's the subscriber experience, and that's what they care about. So why should it be any different from the neutral host network than it does a DAS or than it does their macro networks? I think by and large, if you're going into an underserved property and they're buying a network, they're buying it because it's poor quality as it is, right? So you kind of have this operator lens of it's got to meet their standards. And this network's being deployed because the standards aren't being met by anybody. So I think that's a big piece. Touched on maybe a different topic, which is capacity. The people always ask that question. A category A radio can serve 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz per radio, in which case you've got way more, so further you're unserved, so there's no capacity. But you plug these things in, you have more capacity probably per radio than the carriers would have brought in the DAS in the first place. And so I think the capacity conversation is probably a little bit skewed because it's not understood at the moment. But yeah, there should be plenty of capacity, especially on the in-building side, compared to what would have been on a legacy kind of model.
Well, plus you can bring in a DAS architecture still with CBRS. I mean, you're not limited to that small cell architecture where you've got kind of 2 by 20 megahertz channels. I mean, that certainly makes it more cost effective to scale down to kind of those smaller buildings, sub a couple 100,000 square feet. But when you get above that, you can still use, DAS architectures with kind of more software defined radios and leverage more of the band if you need to.
Yeah, there should be plenty of capacity. Good, so I agree. Like, should be plenty of capacity, and people bring that up as a topic about CBRS, but I don't see that as a strong argument.
I mean, I think you still hit an issue at the high end, right? I mean, you look at, like, again, going back to like the Super Bowl venues, right? I mean, in those venues, each carrier is going to want, 150 megahertz of capacity, not shared between that and the private networks. Yeah. For I think kind of the middle prize, which is more what we're talking about, it's less of an issue.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think Super Bowl is a very extreme truck requirements, as we know, right? They're bringing not just mid-band, they're bringing millimeter wave band. So they're throwing everything at that particular venue for that limited period of time where everyone's just streaming and uploading, doing all kinds of stuff.
The large venues, right? It's
Yeah, so one particular thing to note is that CBRS or CBST devices come with a limited EARP regulation and so on. So the more carrier you add, the footprint of the coverage will shrink. So more radios you need to cover the same areas. So you need to keep in mind implication of a simple design, cost effective and right capacity day one, and you can scale it up further.
Okay, also getting some questions, and again, it was touched on slightly, but where do we see the key use cases? Is it now currently voice, or are other services being the primary driver here?
Well, I mean, to me, neutral host is voice coverage. I mean, that's a use case in and of itself, right? If you look at the use cases for the CBRS network, you've got all the private use cases, and then kind of voice coverage is really the key driver for the public side, right? And some of the verticals, I think, like healthcare is a good example. There's a lot of really strong use cases on the private side, but I think that the biggest use case that they're looking for is kind of that multi-carrier voice coverage inside of their facility. So I think that for some verticals, this application is going to drive the adoption of these types of networks. If you look at kind of the private wireless deployments to date, it's been more, I would call it kind of more IoT types of use cases so far. More things in manufacturing or logistics that have been driving a lot of the adoption. I think the tipping point is really this neutral host model pushes things over the edge for, hotels and casinos, for education, for office buildings, for all these verticals where you've got a lot of foot traffic.
Yeah, I agree with what Rob was just saying. Sorry, Keon. Wherever there's customer satisfaction, I just had a call with our real estate group, and we're expanding into a new building, and I was asked to just see, is there anything there? Is there an interest? What's the coverage pain point? And I was amazed at the response, like, you can bring coverage in our building. And they were thrilled because as you try to bring people back to the office, they want a positive experience. And so one of those things that they were very interested in is like, yes, this would be tremendous. This would be an incentive to bring people back to the office, or like we were saying, casinos, hotels, anywhere where you're going to be able to differentiate your customer's experience, I think is the opportunity. Voice service, yes. 911, yes. But yeah, that where the customer experience is fundamental to your business. I mean, there you go.
Yeah, because a lot of the traffic for these same types of places, I mean, the data traffic is probably mostly on Wi-Fi today for most of those types of places. And if you look at those verticals, I mean, it's like Jonathan was just saying, I think that experience is part of what all the building owners are going to have to deal with. I mean, we do a lot of work in the healthcare space, and if you look at, there's a group that does kind of like a CSAT score, like a customer satisfaction score for healthcare. I guess it's more patient satisfaction. But one of the metrics that they ask patients about is actually connectivity inside the hospital. And so the healthcare institutions are looking at that, from a scorecard standpoint, because in some cases that can be just as much a negative as if a doctor does something wrong, because they want to be able to show, a TikTok or Instagram of themselves lying all beat up in a hospital bed for some reason, and share that with everyone. And if they can't do it, then that impacts, their experience at that facility just as much as it does if they have, a doctor out of the Mayo Clinic. I mean, connectivity, just kind of the way we are, I mean, it's really kind of core to everything. I think property owners, if they don't have connectivity in there, they have difficulty renting apartments. They've got difficulty filling in tenants for enterprises in office buildings. I mean, it really is kind of a pretty critical to the way society operates today. So.
I 100% agree with everything you guys have said. I'll amplify though. Voice is the prominent piece. Yeah. We have some people coming to us, customers they just want people to be able to make a 911 call, right? And I think Jonathan, you've alluded to it in some past discussions where it's great. It's an amenity that my people can use their cell phone, so TikTok works. I'll prefer Reels or something like that from my past. But that aside, right, the just being able to make a 911 call because somebody's fallen and hurt and got to get help. And so if you can't get on a network, you can't service that. And so there's, I think, an element of that that'll emerge that is just as, I mean, as broad, but it's a big, big thing.
Yeah, that was our priority. 911 and emergency was get this out there, deploy this, and then we'll learn and iterate from there. But yeah, 911 emergency services was the killer feature.
Fumble with Wi-Fi if you have to, like on the amenity side, but you can't make a 911 call on Wi-Fi, period, end of story. It's not going to happen, right? So having that intelligence, and when you start peeling that back, at first, I'll just say way back when, and it was, oh, we can't do neutral host because we can't do 911. That was a CBRS mentality. It's just 911. It's just an LTE network, and the services can be deployed, right? So once we crossed that barrier, and the carriers were in the same boat, like, oh, 911, like, well, actually, we can give you better location intelligence when you have a network in a building than when you didn't have a network in a building. So it solved a way bigger problem. It turned from a CBRS didn't want to do it and carriers were nervous to, wow, this could actually be a really good thing for everybody. But again, it's probably the most critical element that has to be done right. You have other fallback mechanisms for voice and satisfaction, right? But 911 has to be done properly. Right?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, earlier when Rob was talking about, the voice being critical. I mean, something as everything kind of starts with the coverage, right? You got to have the fundamental coverage so that you can make emergency calls, which is a fundamental to our safety, which I'm sure is very important on campuses, anywhere else we live. So I think just fundamentally having a coverage so that you can make, low data intensive when you think about it in terms of the bits. It's not a high capacity need, but it's a very fundamentally important need. And that starts there. Then you got to have that. Then you could layer on all these, advanced data-specific applications. But yeah, the coverage is a fundamental to neutral host network.
All right, we're coming up to the end of our time here, but getting a couple of questions about what is the decision-making process in terms of, do I need DAS? Can I do Wi-Fi? Do I need a neutral host? And do I do MORAN or do I do MOCN? What are those decision points, and what drives those decisions? Anybody want to step up and take a crack at that?
I mean, it's really, those are all technologies, right? I mean, it's really, what are you trying to do from a customer perspective? What are your connectivity requirements? And sometimes that's the toughest conversation to have with the customer, because a lot of times they'll see things like this and they'll say, hey, I need a MOCN network, and I need this or I need that. And what we try and do is start with just fundamental conversations. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to connect? Is it people? Is it devices? What are the applications? What are the throughput requirements? And then there's a number of different tools that we have at our disposal to kind of put those things together. So I mean, I think that kind of speaks to make sure that you've got trusted advisors as you're kind of going through your process that can help guide you, that are not just trying to sell you a widget necessarily. I mean, they really need to understand kind of what you're trying to do, and put in place something that's going to allow you to do that. And I think it's important to think about what you want to do today, but it's also the tougher conversation sometimes is what might you want to do tomorrow, because in all cases it's easier to put a lot of that infrastructure in on the front end than it is on the back end. If you've got to go in and rip up walls and start pulling cabling to do new things in places that you didn't think about before, because you've got all of a sudden new capacity or coverage requirements, it's better to spend a little bit more money up front, thinking about what you might want to do and plan for that kind of on the front end. So
I guess my take on that would be like, if I have to deploy a network, I guess I can deploy a single band radio, dual band, tri-band. So I have an opportunity to touch the system. So just like dig once policy, I can enable radios that can be enabled for neutral host, roaming model, or additional capacity. So it all depends on business outcomes. So decision making will be based on the interest of the venue owner and possible and potential tenants. So that's where we are looking at.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the kind of MORAN and the MOCAN, and obviously there are radio systems out there that supports multiple bands, multiple license band. Every operator have their specific bands that you have to support. So MORAN is going to be, it's going to be more complicated or more sophisticated type of radio, and that sophistication comes with price, and also the operational, in very operational complexity of managing that ongoing basis. So as a kind of a initial neutrals operator, it will be, I think, simpler to kind of adopt a MOCAN, and that's we believe is the reason why MOCAN has become more popular or kind of prefer architecture when it comes to that. But as far as like a DAS versus small cell or MOCAN or neutrals network, this comes down to, we've been talking about it, I think, entire session. It really depends on the applications and kinds of venues. It's a proven architecture for some operators and some venues, some high venues, where you can bring in all kinds of license bands into that. So, and that provides a kind of a, agnostic coverage driven architecture so that each operator can control their KPIs through their own signal source, whether it's a, some sort of a baseband. But when you're talking about different kinds of venues, more kind of mid-size or other venues, neutrals network, MOCAN-based neutrals network, makes a lot of sense from a cost perspective and managing ongoing management perspective as well.
I love Rob's response. Like, it starts with whatever your applications are. What are your needs that you're trying to solve for? And it's not just about solving today, it's about solving for what you're looking to do in the future as well. For instance, if you've chosen a licensed band from a carrier, then you've put yourself down a path. And there's reasons they have to do what they do. And if your aspiration is to put a private network on it, that becomes more complicated by going down that path. These are all kind of technologies, MORAN, MOCAN, and whatnot, right? But it's really like, what are you trying to do with this thing? And what's the best path of going to support that? And avoiding some of the complexities and costs that Kyung had mentioned. And so I know it's funny how people all, MOCAN's a sexy thing. Like, it's just a technology, and it's a technology that's been around for a long time in 3GPP. It just so happens that it's a mechanism that we're using for a neutral host network and in CBRS. And so like it's, again, it's a sexy word of the day, but at the end of the day, you're trying to solve neutral host coverage, probably times 3 carriers. And in some cases, you want that flexibility to go add your private network on top of it and figure out the capacity, figure out the applications and the coverage, but a proper neutral host, a proper operator, whoever you're buying this thing from, can kind of help you work through those kind of decision criteria.
I'll try to wade in a little bit. It's a big question, but to summarize, starting with your use cases, your requirements. Secondary, can you afford the various architectures? And third, it's that operational complexity. And just our story and where we were, Wi-Fi over private cellular keeps coming up. It's not an either or. We need to use all these tools. We're going to have all of these tools in our toolbox. We have an IT staff that's ready to take on some of this. And we also have really great partners. So we're in a good position to say that private cellular makes sense. We have enough varied use cases that we want Wi-Fi, we want private cellular, we want the MNOs, we want fiber. We're going to use it all. And we need to know how to intelligently deploy these capabilities to serve the campus, the students, the faculty. And that's our story. So MOCAN's a tool in our toolbox. CBRS is a tool in our toolbox, and we need to know how to intelligently deploy each one for our use case. And not every enterprise is going to be the same, but I'd say it kind of, it summarizes up into your use cases, how much are you willing to spend to offload that responsibility, and then what is your operational support capabilities within your organization? And then maybe across those 3 domains, you can make an informed decision.
I think.
We're at the end of our hour and a half. Before we close down, are there any key points that we didn't get to today that you want to make sure that we at least speak to today? Or did we cover the important stuff for you guys, for our panelists?
Good on my front. I thought it was great job. Appreciate all the panelists here, the questions, the conversation. Looking back a year ago, this conversation couldn't have happened. So I think it's a good testament to the evolution of this space. But thanks for hosting that, Ed, and on go.
All right, well, we will be posting this to the OnGo Alliance's webpage. If you're looking to deploy a neutral host, you can go look at our members and some of our solutions providers. There are a number of companies that are deploying these, including some of those represented here. And if you have any questions, we didn't get to a bunch of them. We will be posting answers and follow-ups here in the next couple of days or week or two to try and cover those topics or questions we didn't get to directly, and we'll follow up there. But with that, I would like to again thank our panelists. Thank you for their time and their expertise on this. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you to our attendees. And have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you all.